Good evening. This is Pastor Bob Uzzle from the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Corsicana. Hope everybody's having a good day. I have, in addition to being a pastor, I'm also a teacher and an author. I currently teach political science at both Navarro College in Corsicana and Cedar Valley College in Lancaster. And my government students study different issues and have for many years. And one controversial issue, whether you're teaching federal government or Texas government, always comes up is the issue of capital punishment. Just sitting here and recommend this pretty good sized volume that I recommend very highly for those who want to research the subject. The Death Penalty, a Historical and Theological Survey. The author is Dr. James J. McGivern. I had the pleasure of meeting him and hearing him speak. It's hard to believe it's been almost 20 years. It was on Saturday, September 9th, 2000, at the University of Dallas at Irving, Chapel of the Incarnation. And the topic was the death penalty in Christian ethics, past, present, and future. And it was sponsored by Pax Christi, Texas. In Latin, Pax Christi means the peace of Christ. They had a good lecture, questions and answers, lunch, and mass by Bishop Charles Gramman. It's been nearly 20 years ago. We still have the program for it, and I very much got a great deal out of reading Dr. McGivern's book. Now, our current pandemic, if I may say this, one positive thing that's came out of it is most states, including Texas, have put executions on hold and in view of the safety of prison employees. We don't know how long that's going to last. But tonight I want to talk about the history of the death penalties, particularly in Texas, which has a reputation of being the most prolific state for executing people. Another good book here is called The Rope, the Chair, and the Needle, Capital Punishment in Texas. It covers the years 1923 to 1990. James W. Marquardt, Sheldon Eklund Olson, and Jonathan R. Sorensen. This has been an issue of interest of mine for many years. While working on my master's degree in political science at UT Arlington, I had a class that was devoted strictly to the death penalty and nothing else. It was a graduate seminar. Quite interesting, looking at the philosophical, theological, ethical, economic, political, legal, social aspects of a very complex subject. And but as I say, Texas is noted for carrying out more executions than any other state. Our whole frontier tradition has something to do with that. In Texas history, executions and lynchings both have been deemed necessary to preserve the boundary between us and them. State-sanctioned executions increased throughout the Great Depression, but declined after the U.S. entered World War II. Capital punishment declined in response to the civil rights movement and atrocities that were committed in the European concentration camps. By the early 1960s, anti-capital punishment forces were carrying the day as a moratorium on executions was brought about. And then it was interesting that in Texas, the standard method of execution up until 1923 was hanging. Hangings were done on the lawn of the courthouse in the county where the crime occurred. and that was standard procedure for many years. Say 1923 was the last hanging in Texas. It was during the administration of Pat Neff, who, while serving as governor of Texas, changed this, the same Pat Neff that later served as president of Baylor University, my alma mater. And it was in 1924 they changed the method from hanging to the electric chair. And executions began to take place at the state prison in Huntsville. And this went on for 40 years. I have not yet been to the museum at the prison there. I hope to at one point. I think it'd be very interesting. But they have on display old Sparky. That was the name of the electric chair used there for many years. The last execution by electricity in Texas was in 1964. And the whole country went into a moratorium on executions. And keep in mind the term moratorium is used quite a bit in this discussion, and bear in mind there's two distinct practices, moratorium and abolition. With abolition, you get rid of it completely, abolish it, no more at all. With a moratorium, you still have capital punishment on the books. You still have capital trials. You can still sentence people to death. You just don't execute anybody during the moratorium. And again, the 1960s stress on equality, human rights, all the optimism of that era certainly had an effect in carrying over what would and would not happen in executions. And different governors had different viewpoints on that, but you know, politics shapes a lot of things. Interestingly enough, in the state of California, you can find two contrasts with governors. Pat Brown, the father of the more recent governor, Jerry Brown, was a Roman Catholic and personally opposed to the death penalty. In spite of his personal opposition, he felt obligated to follow the law, and he carried out 36 executions while governor of California. Future President Ronald Reagan was a staunch supporter of the death penalty, but his administration fell within the moratorium, and so there was only one execution in California when Reagan was governor. As they say, that's the way the ball bounces sometimes, and that's very true. So the modern era really begins in 1972, when a very important decision was handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court. This decision was Furman versus Georgia. In this decision, June 28, 1972, the court declared unconstitutional, not capital punishment per se, but the way it was being administered at the time. And they left the door open that changes could be made in capital punishment laws, that at some point in the future it might be workable again. And it's very interesting, there were 9 separate opinions written. Every justice on the Supreme Court wrote an opinion. There was a majority opinion, 4 concurring opinions, and 4 dissenting opinions. The 5 justices that voted to strike down the death penalty had all served with Chief Justice Earl Warren, who had retired in 1969. Warren, by the way, had been appointed by Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1953 And so serving throughout most of the 50s to the end of the 60s, he was at the helm of the Supreme Court during a period of massive social change in this country. And again, these 5 justices had been his colleagues. The 4 dissenting justices had all been appointed to the court by Richard Nixon. Now, many people at the time thought that was it. No more executions in the country. These were famous last words, because a number of states went to work and rewrote their capital punishment law, including Georgia, including Texas. Texas passed their bill in the summer of '73. I was working in Virginia at that time. But they came, they had to wait on a court ruling to give them the green light. And that green light finally came on July 2nd, 1976, 2 days before the U.S. bicentennial. That was Gregg versus Georgia, that upheld the new revised statutes in Georgia and Texas and some other states. And they basically said, okay, you can resume executions again. On the same day, the court in Woodson versus North Carolina rejected North Carolina's mandatory death penalty. Basically, what that means is if a person commits a particular crime in a particular manner and they're found guilty, they will receive the death penalty, no exceptions. And they rejected that. The court said they had, first of all, to have a bifurcated trial. That means 2 phases. Phase 1, guilty or not guilty. Obviously, if a person is found not guilty, then they will not, that's where it ends. They're free to go. If they're found guilty, then they got to move to phase 2 and determine punishment. And again, it can't be a mandatory sentence. They've got to consider aggravating factors that make it worse, mitigating factors that make it not as bad. Among other things they have to consider, is this person a continuing threat to society? The term society can mean prison society. Would the person be liable to commit crimes against other inmates? And they considered these matters in determining, the constitutionality of it. And in our death penalty seminar, we had a mitigation specialist speak to our class and give a very interesting discussion. Now, with most of the time, when a person is charged with a crime and the death penalty is sought, the person is found guilty, because prosecutors generally don't seek the death penalty unless they have a very strong case. It's unusual for a person they seek the death penalty, the person's found not guilty. But if a defense attorney can convince the jury to sentence them to something other than death, they've generally done a good job. Mitigation specialists generally don't testify in court, but they do background research. They seek to determine if they talk to family, they talk to former employers, teachers, coaches, anybody that can say something good about the person, to demonstrate they do have redeeming social value. They have something to contribute to society. And the first execution, we use the term post-Furman to discuss execution since 1972 decision. The first was in January 1977, Gary Gilmore in Utah. This was a voluntary execution. Gilmore had waived his appeals, had requested to be executed, and had tried suicide a number of times. And he finally went before the firing squad. And at the time, Utah maintained the firing squad because of the Mormon religious belief in the shedding of blood. Well, that was quite interesting. But 1979 would be the first time that an involuntary execution occurred since the Furman decision. And that occurred in Florida with the death of John Spinkelink in the electric chair. And Texas did not resume executions until 1972. I'm sorry, 1982. And Texas, by the way, had pioneered a new method of execution known as lethal injection. Various means of executions have been developed, and all along they argue we're trying to make it more humane. And the guillotine was developed in France because it was considered more humane than the axe. Electrocution was considered more humane than hanging. And at first they claimed that lethal injection was relatively painless. They know different now. There's been some tests to indicate otherwise. But Texas first used lethal injection. Now it's interesting, I mentioned in 1977, that was Gary Gilmore. That was the only execution in the United States that year. That same year, France executed 2 men by guillotine. Shortly afterward, France abolished the death penalty. 2 executions in France, 1 in the United States, and then the 2 countries began going in the opposite direction. And today, with the exception of Belarus, the entire European continent does not have the death penalty. When Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor of California, he presided over the execution of Tookie Williams of the gang known as the Crips. He's a native of Austria, Arnold Schwarzenegger is. And he was, they had an athletic stadium named after him. After that execution, his home country disowned him, removed his name from the athletic stadium. Well, Texas developed lethal injection. It was first used on December 7th, 1982. The first person to die from lethal injection was an African American named Charlie Brooks Jr. On December 14th, 1976, Charlie Brooks and his fall partner, Woody Louders, their car ran hot, and they decided to borrow a car to, quote, test drive. They wanted to do some shoplifting. Well, they went to a used car lot on the south side of Fort Worth, and the company required that an employee accompany anyone who went on a test drive. Well, David Gregory was a used car lot mechanic. He went with Charlie and Woody. He was taken to a motel on Rosedale in Fort Worth. A bullet was put in his head. Only one shot was fired. It was never determined who the trigger man was. The law parties declared both men guilty, though. They were found guilty. At the time, Jack Strickland was assistant district attorney. He prosecuted both men, gave both of them the death penalty. However, Woody Louders later got a 40-year sentence on a plea bargain, and in the end, he managed to be released on parole. Charlie Brooks didn't do so well. In the meantime, he converted to Islam while on death row. He changed his name to Sharif Ahmed Abdul Rahim, meaning noble, praiseworthy servant of Allah. And one article in the Texas Monthly stated that he tried Christianity, he tried Islam, he tried the courts, but none of them saved him from the sentence of death. He was executed on December 7th, 1982. I never met him, but I've become very close to his family since then. At the time of the execution, I was living in Kaufman and serving as pastor of the Macedonia AME Church. I called Imam Shakir Muki of the Fort Worth Masjid of Al-Islam. He agreed to let me make remarks at the funeral. It was held at the Masjid on December 10th, 1982. Now, Charlie had never worshiped there because he was not a Muslim while he was out running the streets. His ex-wife Joyce and his sons Derek and Keith became friends of mine and are still friends of mine to this day. During my pastorate at Forest Hill AME Church between 1999 and 2002, Joyce Brooks worshiped with us on several occasions. In 2012, I gave Keith Brooks the idea. He took the ball and ran with it. It was on December 7th of 2012, the 30th anniversary of Charlie's execution, that we held a memorial service at the Riverside Community Center. And Derek Brooks, his other son, prepared a very impressive PowerPoint presentation about his father and his experience in leading up to the execution. There's a number of interviews with members of the Brooks family on YouTube today. This was the first execution by lethal injection. Obviously, it got a lot of publicity. Over time, the first few did. Over time, it became no longer front page news. Only a few very high profile executions have really got out there. And some of them have been a lot of attention has been focused on. Bill Crawford edited a book called Texas Death Row, Executions in the Modern World, and he describes a number of people, some of whom I knew personally. In the 1990s, I used to go to Huntsville fairly often and minister to death row prisoners, and got very close to some of them. It was In 1993, I was deeply saddened by the execution of my friend Karla Santana on March 23rd. He was from the Dominican Republic. He was not the famous Mexican rock star, although like me, he was a fan of Karla Santana. He was convicted in connection with the failed $1.1 million robbery of a Purolator armored car and the killing of the security guard Oliver Flores in Houston on April 21st, 1981. The testimony showed that he and his accomplice, James Ronald Means, wore matching green military-like uniforms for a noon attack on the van. And a second security guard who survived the attack said Flores was shot even though he had not gone for his gun. And his accomplice was later executed in 1998. But Carlos was not the trigger man. He didn't kill anybody. He didn't intend to kill anybody. But he was charged and convicted of capital murder and put to death. And actually, he did this other guard. He managed to save her life to prevent his co-defendant from killing her as well. And we had the New York-based committee to save the life of Carlos Santana sent over 500 letters to Governor Ann Richards. And I think I was Carlos' last visitor before he went to the death chamber. Last meal, he requested justice tempered with mercy. And his last statement is, "Love is the answer, not hatred. I love all you guys. I will see some of you in the state of heaven. Bye." I sure miss Carlos. So many different decisions have been handed down by the courts down through the years. Most of them have upheld the death penalty. There have been the question of racism in the sentencing process. Nobody can deny that it occurs. But one decision said that was really beside the point because they didn't want to have the question of guilt or innocence to be lost in the sea of statistics. Also, there have been a couple of decisions that were favorable to the abolitionist movement. They can't execute someone who's mentally retarded or someone who was under 18 at the time of the crime. There's a decision that came down. Well, it started out in the 1980s. Another inmate that I know personally, Thomas Millerell, is still alive. Miller-EL signifies membership in the Moorish Science Temple, the oldest African American Islamic organization in America, founded by Prophet Noble Drew Ali in 1913. And all the members are either EL or BEY, Bay. Well, Thomas Millerell was convicted of robbery murder of a Holiday Inn in Irving, Texas, across from Texas Stadium. November 1985, the Moorish Science Temple held a convention there. And a week later, the office was robbed, one person was killed, another person was crippled. Thomas was arrested the next week in Houston. He was identified as the gunman. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. His case went through many rounds of appeals. And then eventually it reached the U.S. Supreme Court. they ruled in his favor because there was in 1985, 86 actually, shortly after the murder occurred, a very important decision was handed down by the court, Batson versus Kentucky. In this decision, they declared that race could not be used as a reason for a peremptory strike. What I mean by peremptory strikes, both sides, the defense and the prosecution, are allowed so many peremptory strikes from the jury pool during what they called the voir dire. And until that time, they didn't have to give an explanation of the reason for striking someone. Obviously, the prosecution desires to get a conviction. The defense desires an acquittal. And they try to get people on the jury that are going to be more sympathetic to their position. Well, there was a manual that was used in the Dallas County DA's office up until the early 1980s. It was written by former Assistant District Attorney John Sparling, which declared that blacks, Latinos, Italians, Jews, and a certain other number of people tend to have persecution complex and be sympathetic to the accused. It was recommended they be struck from the jury pool. And it's not legal to use a manual like that today. Well, and that was introduced in this Kentucky case in which this African American defendant had been convicted by an all-white jury. And anyway, with the case of Thomas Millerell, most of the prospective black jurors had been struck. There was one African American who did serve on the jury. He had expressed the opinion that for a crime like that, lethal injection was too easy. The person should be dipped in honey and staked in an ant bed. They wanted him on the jury. Well, anyway, the case was remanded back to the local court. And in the meantime, Dallas County had an election. Craig Watkins became the first African American district attorney, and he hired as a prosecutor a lawyer who worked for Doug Parks, who was Thomas's attorney. That created a conflict of interest. Thus, the Dallas County DA's office could not be involved at all. A special prosecutor was appointed from Fort Worth, and he felt like he had a strong case, would probably get another conviction. But due to the fact that, again, as I said a while ago, they have to determine, is this person a continuing threat to society? And that may include prison society. Thomas had been in prison 20 years, had not been a disciplinary problem at all. So as a result of that, he did not, the prosecutor had a question as to whether he could actually get another death sentence. So they plea bargained. Thomas pleaded guilty to murder, and they dropped capital murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. This is not life without parole because it was committed back in the 80s. On September 1st, 2005, the Texas legislature adopted life without parole. And the fact that a number of these, the fact that there's been this option now, juries can sentence prisoners to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The number of new death sentences has declined now that juries have that option available to them. And and there have been over 500 executions since 1982. Again, not everyone becomes a real high-profile case. It was in, I'll tell you about a couple of cases that have been really hot topics. One was in 1998. February the 3rd, Karla Faye Tucker. She was the first woman put to death in Texas since the Civil War. Convicted in the June 1983 pickaxe slaying of 27-year-old Jerry Lynn Dean at the victim's apartment in Houston. He and his companion, 32-year-old Deborah Thornton, were hacked to death after Tucker and accomplice Daniel Ryan Garrett sneaked into their apartment, supposedly to steal some motorcycle parts. There's was a lot of controversy surrounding this case, and she admitted being guilty of a heinous crime. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. But after going to jail, she became a born-again Christian. Her life totally changed, and she was a blessing to a lot of people. Her last words were, "Yes, sir, I'd like to say to all of you, the Thornton family and Jerry Dean's family, that I'm so sorry. I hope God will give you peace with this. Valu, I love you. Ron, give Peggy a hug for me. Everybody's been so good to me here. I love all of you very much. I am going to be face to face with Jesus now. Warden Baggett, thank you for all so much. You have been so good to me. I love all of you very much. I will see you all when you get there. I will wait for you." And again, there was tremendous amount of controversy because of her becoming a Christian and her changed life. Alan B. Polonsky, chairman of the Texas Board of Criminal Justice, issued the following statement. The issues here were not religious conversion or gender, but rather culpability and accountability. Karla Faye Tucker brutally murdered two innocent people, was found guilty by the court and afforded all legal processes. Although I believe she finally found God, her original awakening could in no way excuse or mitigate her actions in the world she just left, but hopefully will provide her redemption in the world she just entered. And there's a very good movie called Forevermore. She married a chaplain while incarcerated, and there's in that movie the actor who plays the chaplain and the actress who plays Karla Faye Tucker are husband and wife in real life. Forevermore is a very good movie, and but the fact that there have been several women who've been put to death since then, and but most of them have not been as controversial as that of Karla Faye Tucker. There was a lot of controversy about the execution of Gary Graham on June 22nd of 2000. He was convicted in the May 1981 robbery and fatal shooting of Bobby Grant Lambert of Tucson, Arizona, outside a Houston supermarket. One eyewitness picked him out of the lineup. Gary Graham had a long criminal history. He pleaded guilty to about 10 armed robberies about the same time as this particular event. Some of them were pretty violent, but none of the victims died. He claimed in this particular case he was innocent. There was a lot of controversy about the lighting of the parking lot, the height of the gunman, and some other issues involved, and it was delayed repeatedly because of last-minute legal delays. And some very high-profile people. Among those who witnessed his execution were Reverends Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. You know, he had some really superstars in his corner. Danny Glover, Kenny Rogers, and others were pulling for him as well. And he published a book about his case, Don't Execute an Innocent Man, Let the Evidence Be Heard. And but there have been quite a few since then. There's some others that I had contact with, including Carl Eugene Kelly of Waco, who was put to death in 1993, and Walter K. Williams of San Antonio, who was put to death in 1994. And I had visits with them at the prison. And it's been all kinds of efforts to make it fair, so to speak. The idea, well, a black who kills a white's more likely to get the death penalty than a white who kills a black. That's unfair. But how do you eliminate that? And there's a lot of issues involved here. The public support for the death penalty, even in Texas, is declining. And again, the number of new death sentences has been reduced. The number of executions is not as high as it used to be. Certainly, things are on hold right now due to the pandemic. And exactly, when we get back to life as normal, however normal is, well, at that point, we'll have to reconsider a lot of things. But we'll have to, as the old saying goes, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Still, there's overwhelming support for the death penalty. Very interesting lady I had the pleasure of meeting several years ago. She spoke at the Polytechnic United Methodist Church in Fort Worth, Sister Helen Prejean. And she's the author, I've got two of her books, Dead Man Walking and The Death of Innocence. She's a Catholic nun who lives in Louisiana, who's had a ministry to death row inmates for many years. Dead Man Walking is a good movie. Susan Sarandon plays the part of Sister Helen. And in Dead Man Walking, she deals with two different inmates who were put to death, whom she believes were clearly guilty. The movie just has one, and this is a composite character with characteristics of both of these inmates. Death of Innocence is a sequel to it, and the two men that she describes in this book, she firmly believes were innocent but were put to death anyway. They have DNA tests and a lot of other things, and people are being released after years on death row. But those who support the death penalty will argue that the fact that people are being released shows the system is working, and they cannot prove that an innocent person has actually been put to death in recent years, although not everybody agrees with that point of view. And a number of years ago, someone did a study of capital punishment. I forget what state it was in. He had full access to the prison files and other records. And I never will forget what he said. When it was the question came up, were these people actually guilty? In the vast majority of cases, they were, he said. However, there were a few cases that, due to the circumstantial nature of the evidence, a different judge, a different jury might have come up with a not guilty verdict. And one of my colleagues, very conservative Republican, Tea Party type, he admitted there was problems with the death penalty. He said, what are you going to do? Go to the cemetery and stand over the grave and say, I'm sorry? And interestingly enough, there's a group called conservatives concerned about the death penalty. It's not strictly liberals are for it and conservatives are against it. It's not that simple. Conservatives concerned about the death penalty follow traditional Republican principles of believing in limited government and free enterprise and things of this nature. And they feel that capital punishment is not consistent with conservative politics. I mean, if you can't trust the government to regulate the economy, how can you trust the government to decide the all-important issue of life and death? Those are just some of the questions. You know, Texas has a very interesting history, and Texas criminal justice's history is interesting too. And I don't know how long all this is going to last, but these things are taken consideration as we deal with the history of capital punishment in Texas. Have a good evening.